Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our last episode of How Lakes Work. I'm John Miller, president of Muskoka Steamships and Discovery Center, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight as we explore one of Muskoka's greatest treasures, our lakes. This series has been presented in partnership with the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed and brings together outstanding scientists and stewards of the environment to help us understand how our lakes function and how climate change is reshaping them. Together, we'll learn not only about the physics and biology beneath the surface, but also about the cultural and ecological significance these waters hold for all who live, work, and play in Muskoka. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you, our audience, to post questions in the Q&A, and then we'll read them to our presenter at the end of both presentations around 8:30. If your question's already been posted, then click like on that question, and the question will be moved higher in priority. We can't answer all the questions in the time allowed, so if we don't get to yours, please email us in the address we provide in the chat, and we'll work on getting those answers to you. This webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website in a few days' time. So thank you for being here for our last episode of this webinar and for your ongoing commitment to protecting the lakes that define our region and sustain our way of life. I hope you've enjoyed the previous two sessions with our amazing speakers, and I believe you'll be hearing more about new projects before the evening is over. If you have ideas for new webinars that you'd like to see us produce, please enter them in the chat. I'm delighted to introduce Wendy Fairburn, our General Manager of Muskoka Discovery Center, for our land acknowledgement. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, John. Today we gather on this beautiful winter day in Muskoka on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, as well as the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. These lands were negotiated under the terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty No. 61 of 1850 and the Williams Treaty of 1923. Muskoka was named after Chief Miskoke, who was known as the custodian of the wampum belt, called one bowl, one spoon. This is a guiding principle among many Indigenous people to describe an agreement for sharing hunting territory among two or three nations. The bowl represents the land and the resources to be shared peacefully, and the spoon represents the individuals living on and using the resources of the land in the spirit of mutual cooperation. This is a perfect opportunity to reflect on sharing and responsibility for the land and waters, particularly as it relates today to environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm Norman Yan, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers, Dr. Andrew Paterson first, and Elder Christopher Stock, TEHONATÁHNHEN, to conclude our series. We'll start with Andrew Paterson. Andrew is a senior research scientist with the Ontario government and an adjunct professor at Queen's University and the University of Waterloo, although he lives up here in Huntsville. Andrew is an accomplished and much sought-after research collaborator and mentor. While Andrew has worked on lakes all across Ontario, he is best known for his leadership of a 50-year monitoring program of Sentinel lakes in the Muskoka-Haliburton area. His work bridges fundamental and applied science with a clear focus on building the understanding of the impacts of multiple stressors on lakes that is needed to improve lake policy and management. Andrew's 175-odd scientific publications are cited close to 1,000 times annually. I can tell you that's remarkable productivity and application of his work. And I, like many other aquatic scientists, have learned a lot from him. After Andrew's webinar, we'll conclude our series with a webinar from Elder Christopher Stock. Christopher is a fifth-generation member of the Wata Mohawks, whose ancestors relocated to Muskoka with a fair bit of difficulty from Oka, Quebec in 1881. Christopher is a graduate of the Watemohawk Territory Mohawk Immersion Adult Language Program and the Queen's University Indigenous Teacher Education Program. He has put that training to work in many school classrooms using presentations, performances, and music, and his teaching has been recognized by the director of the Trillium Lakelands District School Board. Christopher is a founding member of See Muskoka Through Our Eyes, traditional powwow. If Christopher, I hope you do it again because it's a remarkable event and learning experience, at least it was for me. And through his interactive Indigenous cultural experiences, um, organization. He introduces many audiences to North American Indigenous peoples and their culture, encouraging the growth of truth and reconciliation. I invite you to open your mind and heart to Christopher, but first let me hand the mic over to Dr. Andrew Paterson for his webinar, When Lakes Fall Ill, a review of current threats to lake health in Ontario. Please take it away, Andrew.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Norman, and for the invitation to speak this evening on a topic that I really enjoy, that I love, and I've really enjoyed the previous presentations as well. As Norm said, I have a foot in academia as adjunct professor at Queen's and Waterloo, but my day job is as a research scientist at the Dorset Environmental Science Centre located in Muskoka. I just realized today, I was looking at the calendar, that I am on the last day of my 24th year. Tomorrow, I begin my 25th year with the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks. Today, this evening, I'd like to speak to you, going to change the channel ever so slightly on the theme of how lakes work and try and explain why sometimes it appears that the lakes are not quite working the way we expect. I've titled it When Lakes Fall Ill. I think that might be a bit dramatic, but I do want to review some of the current threats that we're tracking as they may impact lake health in Ontario. And I'm going to concentrate really strongly on the area where I live and where I work here in the Southern Canadian Shield in Muskoka, Haliburton. But let's begin, pan out a bit at the provincial scale. And I think, we could all agree that in a relative sense, we're very lucky in Ontario to be so rich in fresh water. By some estimates, there are more than 250,000 inland lakes that are larger than about a hectare or 2 acres in size. Millions of streams that drain into these lakes or connect the lakes or drain out of the lakes. And the majority of these lie within the Precambrian Shield, which on the map here is this mottled pinkish orangey area. And I love this map because I think sometimes when we close our eyes and think of the Shield, we think of a consistent homogeneous rock, but it's not. It's a really diverse place. And because the Shield is covered by acidic, often shallow, sandy soils, the lakes are quite naturally soft water, low in ion content. They're naturally of quite good water quality. They're also low in nutrient concentrations. This figure here at the bottom right shows the distribution of total phosphorus concentrations in about 2,000 lakes in central Ontario. And you can see it's right skewed, meaning that most of the lakes are on the low end of the phosphorus gradient, of very good water quality. And this is another map that I really love, and it's if you take the province of Ontario and just put the lakes on it, you can see how they really are majority located within the Boreal Shield. This is this area here, again, this mottled pink area, and you see the lakes themselves take the same shape. In northwestern Ontario, there's so much water. If you include the wetlands, it's about over 30% of the land area is water in the northwest. But that very good water quality that we have translates to very high value. And for some, it's very difficult to even put words on that value. It's an intrinsic value. It's a spiritual value or a cultural value. Of course, it also translates into an economic value. And I won't go line by line here, but I've tried to bold the word billion because Ontario attracts tens of millions of visitors every year, and many engage in water-based tourism. and they spend billions of dollars annually doing so. Fishing alone and goods and services is estimated brings in over $1 billion dollars annually. There's of course commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes and some inland lakes. And latest I heard, the figure I heard for dockside value is about 44 million. And of course, for those lucky enough to live and own property on shorelines, there's tremendous value there, estimated over $80 billion dollars, and bringing in annual property taxes in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And you can imagine for some rural municipalities, that's a significant portion of the annual tax base or tax revenue. Now that good value and the high water quality is threatened by multiple stressors. And I'll use the word stressors tonight. I'm talking about threats to water quality. This list of threats you could almost apply to any aquatic ecosystem, certainly in acid-sensitive regions of the world. But some of these threats or stressors are quite local. You know, we think about shoreline development that might impact some lakes, or invasive species that are in some lakes or in chains of lakes. But some other stressors are much more regional in effect. You know, an issue that the Dorset Environmental Science Center was heavily involved with from the late 70s, really into the mid 90s, was looking at the impacts of acid rain and acid deposition. We've perhaps heard stories of it coming from Sudbury, but much here also comes from the long-range transport that can affect broad regions, a broad region of lakes, and many acid-sensitive regions of the world have been impacted by acid rain. Contaminants, for example, microplastics, we know that the air is a major transport vector for microplastics, and so large regions of lakes can be impacted by microplastics. Of course, climate change, I don't think there's any ecosystem in the world that's not impacted in some way by climate change. And of course, I have them here pointing individually into streams and lakes, but of course they interact with one another as well, creating quite complex problems. So how do we assess lake health? We understand the value. We understand that that value might be threatened by different kinds of stressors, local and regional. So how do we assess lake health? And I often like to use a medical analogy of ourselves and human health. And you can imagine that if you were to see a doctor or a nurse practitioner or a healer, or, you know, if you're unfortunate enough to have to go to the emergency, and they might then take your medical history. They're interested in knowing, you know, if what you're experiencing is unusual in some way based on your past history. You might review symptoms and go through the things that are bothering you in the moment. And they might order some diagnostic tests or assessments to understand whether or not, in fact, there's a concern here. It's quite similar with lake health. Instead of a medical history, often we rely on long-term monitoring data. We're fortunate to have a few sites in Canada and around the world that have decades of information that we can look at to understand what is normal, what is the natural variability. I'm trained in a field called paleolimnology, just a fancy way to say that I can use and I look at information in lake sediment to look at environmental history over centuries to millennia. Symptoms might be unusual events that occur, maybe an algal bloom that people living there have never seen before, or a fish kill, or an unusual odor to the water. And then the diagnostic tests and assessments might be looking at things like the physical, chemical, and biological measurements that are made, or maybe experiments in a lab or in the lake itself. Or you might try and create models to try and understand the system better, even run scenarios of how a lake might be responding to different stressors. And as Norman said in the introduction, I lead a long-term monitoring program of Sentinel Lakes. We are located near the town of Dorset, Ontario, at least our head office is. The lakes are throughout Muskoka and Haliburton, so east of Bracebridge. And we have just started our 51st year monitoring the physics, chemistry, and biology of lakes. Though this is a tremendous data set, there are very few data sets like this in Ontario. The experimental lakes area would be one example, and very few also even across the country in North America. But they vary. The systems here really do concentrate on lakes on the southern Canadian Shield. And so we look at lakes that are quite remote, like the picture in the middle, that's Plastic Lake. which is just has a gravel road to it. It's not a winter maintained road. It's mostly forested with a couple of campsites, to more what you might consider recreational cottage lakes. There's a picture from Dickey Lake, for example. And we consider these lakes to be representative of thousands of lakes across the southern Precambrian Shield. First thing I want to say is, and maybe this won't be too surprising when you consider there's 50 years of information, but nearly everything we measure, whether it be physical information or chemical or biological, in these lakes has changed significantly over the last century. And some of these stories that emerge from these changes are good news. So the good news stories, such as the lowering of emissions that cause acid rain, it was discovered at Dorset and other places that the rain was quite acid. A lot of work went into trying to understand the implications of acid rain falling on the environment, on the lakes itself, and the biology. And through that kind of work and the generation of that kind of evidence, it went on to inform policy and legislative changes that resulted in the lowering of these emissions, such as sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide. And the best example I can give of that is in the Sudbury region, again, where changes to legislation changes resulted in now more than a 90% reduction in sulfur dioxide emissions. And so that resulted in other good news stories, evidence of chemical recovery in lakes. One of the ways we can track sulfur in lakes is to look at the anion sulfate. And each line here represents one of the Sentinel lakes. Each dot is a different year from the 1970s to the present day. You can see all of the lakes have come down in sulfate concentrations. Sulfate levels in the lakes now are about a quarter of what they were at the beginning of the record. But there are also some surprises. And one related to acid rain was that there's been a loss of calcium from the Sentinel lakes and many lakes in the region. And, for those of you who took chemistry, say in high school, and did that lab where you did a titration experiment, that's essentially one of the leading causes of calcium decline. That over decades, as you add acid to a system, that calcium was slowly depleted from the soils within the watersheds. And as it depleted the soils from the watershed, then less of it can come into the lake at any given time. And of course, there are other stressors such as trees take up a lot of calcium. So in watersheds where you remove trees, you're also removing the calcium. The new trees take up additional calcium. But that titration experiment and the timber harvesting has slowly caused declines in calcium concentration. You can see that calcium levels do differ a bit across lakes to begin with, but they all show the general decline in calcium concentrations to quite low levels. So, if calcium's declining, why are we concerned, or should we be concerned? And we should, because many aquatic organisms actually need a lot of calcium. They contain a lot of calcium. They need calcium to live. For example, zooplankton, which is a Daphnia, Dr. Yan had talked about in the previous webinar, but some of them are about 5% calcium by weight. Some crayfish species are much higher, 10 to 30% calcium by weight. So they rely on that calcium to make their the carapaces or exoskeletons again. Loon eggs is 30% calcium. And some, for example, there's a lower lethal limit to some of the organisms that live in the lakes, like these amphipods or scuds that we know are around 1 milligram per liter. Well, if you look at the graph from the previous figure, one of our lakes is now crossed this threshold. There's also really important laboratory experiment work done by Dr. Norman Yan as a student, Don Ashforth. And this is looking at zooplankton in the lab in water that's very similar to water in Muskoka. So soft water, a soft water medium, feeding them different levels of food, but looking at, for example, food that would be more typical of a Muskoka lake. And they found when you did that, you began to have problems with reproduction of zooplankton when you're at concentrations around 1.5 milligrams per liter. And even with survival, when you consider, say, higher temperatures, the kinds of temperatures that may be coming as lakes warm with climate change. But I put this study on this graph for one reason. One is that in 2006, when the study came out, there was just one lake in our data set that had crossed this threshold. And now in 2024, the latest year with data here, Four of the lakes have crossed, and a fifth is about to cross. So it looks like calcium levels are reaching levels where we have real concerns for sensitive aquatic organisms. So low calcium in some lakes is affecting the reproductive success and survival of calcium-rich aquatic organisms. The Daphnia are not doing particularly well, some species, but this jelly-clad organism does fairly well. It has much lower calcium burdens. And now another issue on our radar is road salt and its impact on lake health. And we heard a bit about that, I think, in the first evening of the webinar, where both Dr. Sharma and Dr. Hutchinson were describing conductivity levels quite high near the bottom of lakes. So we pan out again to Canada. We know we use a tremendous amount of salt to keep roads safe in the winter, estimated 7 to 9 million tons per year. We use a number of compounds. The most commonly used is sodium chloride, but there are other forms of chloride compounds, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, potassium chloride. Some of these other compounds are used because they can melt ice at lower temperatures, air temperatures than sodium chloride. There are alternatives you may have read about or heard about in the news, such as beet juice and pickle brine. These alternatives cost quite a bit more, estimated 6 to 18 times more. And I think the jury might still be out on whether or not they're necessarily less toxic. You know, beet juice has a lot of sugar, for example. You're adding a lot of sugar to ecosystem. That's not necessarily a good thing either. And we know that roads are the cause of increased road salt, partly because we have a number of lakes without winter maintained roads that have very low chloride concentrations, but also because we have these kinds of relationships. This is actually from streams in southern Ontario. It shows the relationship between road density, which is the kilometers of road you have in a given area. So obviously, you have more roads, winter maintained roads, that number will be higher. And it relates to the maximum measured chloride concentration and the median, which is close to the average chloride concentration. You see strong positive relationships. More roads that are winter maintained where road salt's added, the higher the chloride we find in those streams. And because lakes are down hill of streams, it's not surprising we see very similar long-term trends of increasing chloride levels in inland lakes. A good example, I could show many examples, but one with a long-term record is Lake Simcoe. This is many different sites on the lake, and one of those sites actually had data going back to the early 1980s, where you can see that chloride concentrations in Simcoe were probably hovered around 10 milligrams per liter in the 1980s. That same site is up around 60 or 70 milligrams per liter chloride. So a significant rise, and it's continuing to rise. Now, what about in more rural lakes, like where I live and work here in Muskoka? This is actually the Dorset Environmental Science Center, and just for context, this is Paint Lake or Bay of Paint Lake that Dr. Sharma mentioned in her webinar in the first week, if you were there. And what about these kinds of lakes where the stream example I showed was in more urban southern Ontario location. Although the numbers are lower for chloride, the same pattern is happening. There are actually some earlier data for Lake Muskoka than I show here, which show even lower concentrations. But this is multiple sites on Lake Muskoka that show the same positive rise in chloride concentrations over time until about 2015. And these sites here along the bottom, there are multiple lakes shown here. This line on the bottom are actually those remote lakes that we monitor and have for decades that do not have winter maintained roads. So this is probably close to what the natural concentration should be like for chloride in the Muskoka lakes. So how high is too high? We talked a bit about how low is too low for calcium. So how high is too high for chloride concentrations? And again, I like to use Muskoka lakes or lakes within Muskoka as an example. And partly because the district of Muskoka has such a wonderful monitoring record, monitoring program. They monitor roughly about 80 lakes per year. They rotate through about every 3 years. They complete that cycle. And what you're looking at here, I'll spend some time on this, is every colored line is a different year of data. And this is just ranking the lakes from the lowest chloride concentration on the left all the way up to this kind of hockey stick to the lake at the tops here, which is the saltiest lake in Muskoka, which would be Jevons Lake. And this is the chloride concentration again of the lake. So many lakes are on the lower end, but there are a significant number of lakes that have higher chloride concentrations. The other thing on this graph I wanted to point attention to was this dashed arrow to 120. That's marking what the Canadian Water Quality Guideline for chloride is to protect aquatic life from chronic or long-term exposure. And if you just looked at that number and you looked at the Muskoka lakes, you would think that, well, some of the lakes are getting close, so we should be careful, but that all the lakes in this data set are below this guideline for protection of aquatic life. So aquatic life may be well protected here. Now, the issue with this is that the Canadian Water Quality Guideline, having first of all one number for the country, doesn't really work for the softwater lakes in Muskoka Halliburton. It's based on a series of tests of aquatic life in experimental setting, but in an ideal lab setting. So it doesn't really represent the setting in nature where perhaps organisms are not quite fed as well as they would be in the lab. And it also, many of these tests are done in a medium that is a hard water medium that's full of ions. That's not the environment that the soft water, low ion environment that the organisms in Muskoka Halliburton live in. So recognizing some of these deficiencies in the Canadian Water Quality Guideline and the way that we test for this at the Canadian level, again, Dr. Yan, this time a student, Aaron Brown, ran some experimental work on a zooplankton species, looking at chloride concentration, but also with respect to different levels of food, and run the experiments in a soft water medium. That was the really critical part, because that's not how it's being done when the establishment of the Canadian Water Quality Guideline. And they found when they did that they began to find sensitivity or toxicity with respect to how reproductive success now at concentrations much lower than the 120, around the 50, for example, 50 milligrams per liter, particularly when you had food concentrations, which are more typical of what you actually find in lakes for zooplankton to eat. And then in a follow-up study a few years later, Shelley Arnott with Martha Solis Salgado, also Norm Yan and myself and others, Shelley did work on more than just the one species, but on six species of zooplankton or Daphnia that commonly exist in Muskoka lakes. And when she began to look at the range of toxicity, she found that the most sensitive taxon, the most sensitive species, was showing evidence of toxicity at even lower concentrations, as low as 5. So when you begin to consider and run tests that are appropriate for the lakes that that the zooplankton actually live here in Muskoka Halliburton, find that the number likely for on average probably sits closer to the 20 milligrams per liter range as an appropriate target or guideline. And then when you apply that number, you can see that there are many lakes in Muskoka that have already exceeded that. The final topic that I want to talk about here as I work through the presentation is something that I've worked on for over 20 years now, and that is looking at algal blooms and trying to explore what are the possible drivers of algal blooms. So now I've moved to perhaps a symptom of lake health. And I've done work across the province, including here in the heart of Algonquin Provincial Park. Dixon Lake, or a couple of backcountry canoers came across this quite severe algal bloom and reported it in 2014. It then bloomed again in 2015 with a blue-green algal bloom. But quite an unusual event, given this is a very isolated lake, quite remote lake in the heart of the park. So we care about algal blooms for many reasons, and I've gone into many rooms with the general public to give presentations. And algal blooms often come up in topic and often in the question and answers, because they impact water color, the recreational value of lakes. They can reduce water clarity. Eventually, that large amount of biomass will die and sink to the bottom of the lakes and decompose, and that can consume oxygen, which is a concern. Some algal blooms can be really quite smelly, and I've been on many blooms, and not even blue-green algal blooms that smell like rotting garbage or rotting fish. which are just caused by the algal species that are present. And some algae, under some circumstances, can produce toxins that can be harmful to humans, to pets, and other animals. The government of Ontario doesn't have a formal algal monitoring program per se, but they have a reporting program where members of the public can perhaps call the Spills Action Center. Then we'd have an environmental officer go out, take water samples, and confirm that in fact there was a bloom. And what you're looking at here is the confirmed blooms of these such reports that are blue-green algal blooms. Now, initially, it was kind of an informal program until about 2005, when it became actually became a provincial algal bloom response protocol. And one thing I would say about this, because it's not a formal monitoring program, is it's very difficult to tease apart whether or not this increase is driven by something in the environment or increased by, say, an increased awareness. Because you see jumps right here after the program becomes formalized and people become aware of the program. There's a big jump. And actually, there are sometimes big jumps because of things that have happened in the media more broadly. This is actually after Lake Erie had a major algal bloom that affected the drinking water supply of Toledo, Ohio. There was a huge jump in awareness. Got tons of course, national, international media coverage. And then from then, we had another big jump in reports. But one of the reasons why we think the environment is playing a role here as well is the bottom graph, which is that not only have reports gone up, but the number of lakes with a first time ever report has also been rising over time. And we see this particularly in the last few years, the highest levels of new lakes joining this data set of confirmed bloom report lakes. So we've started to do work with university collaborators. We've worked on a number of sites across the province, including, as I said, in Algonquin Park, the 3 Mile Lake, a number of lakes in the Algoma region, and some of the larger lakes like Nipissing and Lake of the Woods. I think a pattern is starting to emerge with respect to our understanding of why some of these blue-green algal blooms might be occurring. And well, first of all, I'll say that nutrients are still definitely an important part of the story. Um, we know, for example, and the reason is partly because we know that there is a very strong relationship between the nutrient phosphorus, particularly in low nutrient lakes within the Precambrian shield, and the amount of algae you find in a lake. You see this spatially across lakes. So a low phosphorus lake compared to a very high phosphorus lake, the high phosphorus lake tends to have more algae. But we even see this within our sentinel lakes. This is 2 lakes, Plastic Lake and Harp Lake, Plastic with no cottages and Harp Lake with cottages. And over time, with each point representing a different year of data, over time, there's a positive relationship between phosphorus and algal biomass. And we also know that if you have major inputs of external nutrients, agriculture from say agricultural activities or urbanization, you see big inputs of phosphorus. We see big changes in algae. But they're important, but nutrients are not the whole story. And one of the things we're seeing in the Bloom Report data set, which is interesting, is that several of the lakes with algal blooms would pass water quality guidelines for total phosphorus. And what I mean is that 44%, so we're getting close to half of the reports are from low nutrient lakes where the spring total phosphorus concentration is less than 10 micrograms per liter, which is considered very good water quality for phosphorus. And even in some sites where we have longer term monitoring data for phosphorus, so we know that the phosphorus concentration in some of those sites is it's not changing, it's stable. Or even in some sites, it seems to be declining, and even though there are reports of blue-green algal blooms. So what else is important then? Well, we know that weather is important. We know that blue-green algal blooms tend to do well when we've had periods of elevated temperature, relative calm in the water column, so periods of reduced wind, lots of light, sunny and sunshine. And I think that's partly because blue-green algae have this ability to be buoyant in the water column, so they can rise up to the surface and they can take advantage of all that sunlight for photosynthesis. They also then can shade out other algae below them. We also know that changes to the food web can have an impact. And we've talked already a bit about calcium decline and chloride increases and how that might impact zooplankton. And Dr. Yan talked about how important zooplankton are as grazers of algae. If you have disruptions to things like the grazers, that could have an impact on algae. There's been one study I'm aware of that really did link calcium decline and its impact on zooplankton to an increase in the amount of algae in a lake. And over all of this, again, is climate change, which can impact all of these things, in particular the weather, because we're learning that climate change can really exacerbate algal blooms for a number of reasons. And this will tie into some of the webinars you've seen. Dr. Sharma's, Dr. Hutchinson's webinar, and the first webinars on the first week, for example, we know climate change can increase the length of the ice-free season and the length of the growing season, which can favor growth of algae. From some of the information from the Dr. Hutchinson gave, we know that climate change is leading to periods of a more stable water column where the thermal stratification, the separation of the warm upper water and the cooler deep water can last for longer and could be more stable. And the longer you separate that deep water from the atmosphere, then the longer there's time for oxygen to be consumed through decomposition. And as it's consumed, then you get an increase in phosphorus loading from the sediment that's chemically released from the sediment. That, of course, is phosphorus that's really available for algae to take advantage of. Reduced wind speeds, again, helps with that more stable water column. And then changing precipitation patterns. There's changes in the timing of precipitation with climate change, and then the amount in that we can get very large storms that cause big pulses of nutrients. There was a watershed in the Lake of the Woods watershed that up in northwestern Ontario that we worked on that showed that one rainfall event, an extreme rainfall event, was bringing close to 50% of all the phosphorus that goes into that lake in a given year. So that's a significant event. And I know some of these graphs are small, but I'll take you through it. I just want to talk about climate change a bit and what we've learned in Lake Nipissing, Ontario. So this is actually a record partly from the sediment. As I talked about, we can reconstruct hundreds of years of information. This record goes back to about 1800. And the top graph is for multiple sites in Lake Nipissing. And it's a measure of the amount of algae in the lake. And you can see from the 1800s into the 1900s, and you get more intense development in the watershed, you get a pulse of algae. But the highest levels of algae occurred in this green shaded region. And this is the region where there are reported blooms of blue-green algae. The other graph B shows the air temperature. We have a pretty long record from the airport in North Bay. You see air temperatures are at their highest during this shaded region. The wind speeds are at their lowest. The length of the ice-free season is its longest. This is the ice cover is the lowest. And also some of the highest precipitation events occur during this bloom period. So it's a combination. It's almost as if climate change can create, at some years, almost a perfect storm for the development of blue-green algal blooms. And it seems that sensitive lakes, there's some lakes that we call repeat offenders. They tend to get the same blue-green blooms year after year. And they all tend to be quite similar. They tend to be relatively shallow. The repeat offenders all seem to be less than about 15 meters deep, but deep enough to thermally stratify, so separating into that warm upper layer and the cool deeper layer, meaning that the deep layer is quite a small volume to begin with, so oxygen can be used up quite quickly. And when that happens again, you get this internal loading of phosphorus. Hamels Bay and 3 Mile Lake is a good example where you look, this is just the phosphorus concentration throughout the days of the year, 250 being, here we are in September. The green line is the surface water, which doesn't vary that much through the year, but in the deep water, the blue line, then you see that giant pulse of phosphorus coming up from the sediment that the algae can take advantage of. It's, what is it, maybe an order of magnitude higher phosphorus concentration than what's in the surface. So overall, in terms of the threats, I say that we have pretty good evidence that some things have improved, that acid deposition has declined, Acidity is decreasing in lakes. We have good evidence of chemical recovery. Phosphorus concentrations in the Sentinel Lakes, I didn't have time to really go through that story today, but phosphorus concentrations have declined or have been quite stable in the lakes. In fact, they declined through the 80s into the early 1990s and have stayed the same. One of the leading theories on this is actually a gradual regreening of the region, Muskoka Halliburton. I saw a picture today. I didn't quite have in time to add to the talk, but I saw a picture today which was from the Dorset Fire Tower in the 1950s, and it overlooks farm fields, which are now all forested regions close to the town of Dorset. I know some things have worsened. Calcium concentrations are declining. As we know, salinity levels are increasing. We talked about particularly because of road salt addition, and climate change is impacting lakes in myriad ways. And we're uncertain about some things there because they're emerging concerns, although we've just started to explore on some of these issues. Uh, Things like pharmaceuticals and personal care products, some of these chemicals may be increasing in some lakes. Microplastics is where we've just done some work over the last couple of years, perhaps, and again, another future story to tell. And things like PFAS or forever chemicals that we're just beginning to learn about and begin to try and measure in some of these systems. But the takeaways from the threats portion is that, water quality of Ontario lakes, despite what I've been saying, is still generally very good. I've often said if you take the lakes of the world and line them up and put the Ontario lakes in that group of lakes, they'd be up on the high water quality end. That in a relative sense is still very, very good. But they are threatened. Local and regional stressors do threaten aquatic health. I won't repeat this again, but some of the stories we told today about declining calcium levels and their impacts are increasing chloride concentrations. Always important to remember that environmental stresses don't act in isolation. Even the chloride story and the calcium story are linked because it appears that chloride toxicity may increase as calcium levels decline. And then it's going to take creativity, perseverance, and collaboration to work towards solutions because these are complex problems. But I think there are positive signs this is happening. And I did want to leave you with one story with respect to calcium decline. It's not my story, not an Ontario story, but it is a community-based initiative that I've been tracking and I think is doing excellent work. And that is the project called Ash Muskoka, being led by one of our hosts tonight, the Friends of the Muskoka Watershed. And they, recognizing the problem. Of course, Dr. Norman Yan was actively involved in the science side before Friends of the Muskoka Watershed and understood the issue of calcium decline. But understanding that wood ash is a potential solution if spread within watersheds to help replenish some of that calcium. There was a goal to develop the first non-industrial wood ash recycling program. A lot of work to do this. Obviously, you needed a lot of wood ash, but there needed to be proof that it could work. Wood ash, in order to collect it and spread it, there were certain hurdles and the approval side that needed to be met. And of course, getting people involved and excited about such a project and then educating them on that project. And so they did the legwork. They've collected tons of wood ash. They've secured the needed government approvals. And then the science is really a key component of this. They've done in partnership with universities, testing the chemistry of the ash to see whether or not at first it had enough calcium, but what else does it have in it? Anything of concern? Determining back to the medical analogy, determining what are the actual doses that need to be added to watersheds for example, to improve the health of the forest. And that work's being done. And they now know that if you add 4 tons of wood ash for about every hectare of land, that has dramatic improvements to the health of the forest. And then, of course, moving forward by communicating and getting people involved in recycling wood ash going forward. And it appears to be working. There's from what I've heard, there are over 1,000 people saving their wood ash is being collected and being spread across Muskoka. So I want to say if you want more information again on this, and with permission, Dr. Norman Yan has given me this email, so I suggest you take it down if you're interested. And finally, I'll just say. I can't go through all the names and the various topics I talked about today, but many people are involved with this work, and including university collaborators. I want to thank that my colleagues at the Dorset Environmental Science Center are involved with all aspects of the work, from collection of data to analyzing the chemistry, database management, and reporting. So it's a good group of people. I'm happy to see them every day, and I'm going to leave it there. Just before I pass it on to Christopher Stock, though, I just say remind everyone that there is a Q&A button. If you'd like to add your questions at any time, that would be great. Thanks very much for your time.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Paterson. Very interesting studies that have been made. And with me being 53 years old, so the study is only 2 years younger than I am, which kind of puts things into a different perspective. So what I'd like to do right now is I want to change our hat and take off our reading glasses, and now we're going to put on some sunglasses to have a little bit of two-eyed seeing here. I am the founder and sole proprietor of A Journey Begins, an interactive Indigenous cultural experience. The Mohawk means Jijo Daswant Dewa Dandi. It means the place where you begin to walk. What I want to do is I'm going to gather our minds together as one. I put together this presentation using the words from Ohando Gardi Wadekwa, the words that come before anything else. This was the original instruction given to all human beings at the time of our creation. Everything was placed on this earth, was given its own roles, responsibilities, and was left with instructions before he created the human beings. And after he created the human being, he gave us everything on this earth that we needed to live and survive and have a human experience on this planet. He gave it to us openly and freely. And all he asked us to do in return was to look after it, take care of it. And as long as you look after and take care of it, then it will look after you. And even though that is as simple as it sounds, it's very difficult for human beings to remember to continue to do that, which is why he left instructions with everything in creation to be our reminder of just how to do that. So for my presentation, you're going to hear me speaking the Mohawk language, and put together a series of slides with pictures and also the English translation, and then we'll dive it deeper into our topic. Okay, so for the first one, it talks about how all you people listen well for a short time, as the time has come to offer our greetings of love, honor, respect, thanks, and gratitude to our Creator for everything He has placed on this earth and everything that is going around on this earth. The sitwe numerado ne sungwe disum zero e na dao ne zio and zade tokadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi. The sitwe numerado ne sungwe disum zero tkawa ne ganaron quatzerda. Tokadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi. Rawerdon chate wa ni serdage da ye de wada de numerado. Tokadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi. Rawerdon deity numeradon zinyago ongue ye nagade ne zioanzade, togadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi, ronekaronyo zioanzade ne gadi deity numeradon, togadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi, gatsum sagodero ne awanke ne gadi deity numeradon, togadi na yoto no guat ni gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi, Nyate Gunti Ochinuma Sokodaron, Gio and Tade, Negadi de Tinumeradon, Tokadi Nayoto no Guat ni Gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi, Rotkawa ne onumqua ayungwayat agenha, Negadi de Tinumeradon, Tokadi Nayoto no Guat ni Gorda. Onagadi ne oya ne wahi, Rotkawa ne ohande son ne Guntirio audiqua, Negadi de Tinumeradon, Tokadi Nayoto no Guat ni Gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. Nya te ka tita ke rotikawa jiwantade ne gari de tin numeradon to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi, sagari hunte ne ga ni huntesa, ne no ne e agunte hante ne aguegun ka hisoa. Ne gari de tinumeradon to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. To te kawa ga hisoa jiwantade ne gari de tinumeradon to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia, ne wahi, sagari hunde ne asa ne gote noso, ne aze soa, ne gari ne, oneste o se heida dano ne ona umsura, ne gari de tinumerado, to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia, ne wahi, to te kawa ne gakwa, te sunkwa te kawa ne gakwa ne jun hekwa, ne gari de tinumerado, to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. To te kawa ne oger de soa, ne gari de tinumerado, to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. Nya te gunti o ti daa sa godoronji o antade, ne gari de tinumerado, to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. Nya te gunti kuntirio sa godoronji o antade, ne gari de tinumerado, to gari na yoto no gwa ne gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi, sagari hunde ne radiwera rasta, ka yerdi ni onquarare ji ni todi ondakwa, ne gari de tinumeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi, sagari hunde ne radiconoresta, ne gari de tinumeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi, sagari hunde ne radiweras, ganat agodoro e itiwanarunke, ne gari de tinumeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. Sagari hunde ne yeti sota asontanka gardakwa. Te agos watedon dini wasundas. Ne gari de tinumeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi. Rori hunde ne sonkwa tia joka naka gardakwa, te hoswatedon. Ne gari dat sitwe numeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari ne oia ne wahi, sagari hunde ne ojistokwa soa, da hodiswa telon jini wasuntas, ne gari de tinumeradon, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Ona gari aguago, a onde de wa de wayondo, a onde de wa roroge ne gwa ni gorda, dano da sitwe numeradon ne songwa edison, chino hoda songwasa ane ji yoanzade, to gari na yoto no gwa ni gorda. Doga o teno, te gadari hot dakwe, isai gari no ne e se wayadatso, anji se wadasuntaro, anji se watkawe ne gat numera dunsura, to gari numdad gadari watkweni, to niwanage, nyawa. So, in the very beginning, when we talk about the Thanksgiving address, this was the original instruction given to us at the time of our creation. And it reminds us about our relationship with nature and everything that we need in order to survive. We also notice that we don't look at nature in separate segmentations. We actually look at it as all part of a greater whole. Now, our topic is about how lakes work. And what I'm going to share with you is how I understand it from listening to all of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, to my great-uncles, and to some of the elders that were alive on this planet when I was doing some work for the Eagle Project, which was called the Great Effects on Aboriginal People in the Great Lakes Environment. So in 1993, I was part of that Eagle Project, and my job was to do an eating pattern survey as to how many portion sizes of fish, wild game, and any other plants or foods that we would have gathered, roughly how much portion size would we eat in a day, a week, a month, and a year, and roughly whereabouts were these animals caught, so that way they can come back and do some hair and blood samples and see what kind of contaminants we are actually ingesting, whether it be mercury or other contaminants. To us, as Indigenous people, we were always in tune to the natural order of the Earth's rhythm and cycles. And the Earth rhythms cycles typically follow a circle and cycles of the moon and the sun. That's where we have winter solstice, the spring equinox, the summer solstice, and the autumn equinox. Now, winter is typically a time of rest. And that's why I titled my talk, She is Resting, because we view the earth as our mother. Therefore, she is a person. And there's a time to be active. There's a time for growth. There's a time for harvesting and maturity. And then there's a time to rest. And the winter time was typically when we would be resting. During that time period, the lake, as you can see on this picture on the left-hand side here, is a cap on top of that water. It stops the wind from blowing and stirring up the sediment. It gives the lake a chance to rest as well. It gives all that sediment a chance to go down to the bottom in the amount of time that is needed. That way, by the time spring comes and the waters start rushing in, all the new freshness will be coming. Now, in the springtime of awakening and growth, that's when the earth starts to wake up. How do we know that it's actually springtime? Well, one of our first signs of spring would be the maple tree. We would notice the buds would start becoming a vibrant red color. And then the sap would start running. But before we even knew the sap was running, is that at the base of each maple tree, the snow starts to melt around that base of that maple tree. That's because the sap is coming up from the warmer temperatures of the earth and is melting that. That's our first sign to let us know that it's actually running. And then summertime is a time of growth and ripening. Of course, autumn is the time of maturity, harvest, but it also teaches us how to release and let go, because all the leaves of the trees is the letting go. That teaches us how to let go as human beings as well. That's how we let go with grief. That's how we let go of a year cycle. That's how we learn to accept that the only constant is change. And what we have to do is we have to be aware of those changes, and we have to be able to adapt to those changes. And that's where we get that 7-generation thinking. And that's our fundamental principle of all Indigenous peoples across the world, is that we want to make sure that whatever we leave behind, there will be enough for the next 7 generations yet to come. Therefore, we don't take more than what we need. We only we make sure that nothing goes to waste, and we make sure that we share everything equally and inclusively. And that's that whole principle of the one dish with one spoon treaty. And it was an agreement accepted by more than 50 plus nations from the Arctic Circle down to Mexico and the east of the Great River, which is the Mississippi River, including Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Greenland and Iceland. Indigenous peoples strive for peace, balance, unity, harmony, honor, respect, love, thanks, and gratitude for all life. And these are the teachings that I knew and understood. Listening to my grandfather, who grew up surviving off of the land and having a trap line, he always told me that freeze up was very important, but you also had to be very mindful about that time period. because sometimes the lakes don't form a thick enough layer of ice before the snow hits, and it can be deceiving. So you have to really know and observe and understand the types of ice, the types of quality of ice, and where the inlets are from different streams or rivers, because the ice will be thinner in that area, especially because of the currents. And you also have to know and understand the currents of the water, especially on every lake, because the currents will be different around each island. And so there's a lot that has to go into it when you're surviving off the land, because when you're out there, it's just you and the land. And you have to make sure that you survive in order to help keep your family alive. So one of the most important things that he talked about was that once it was froze, then we had a shortcut to get to all of our traps and go across the land. It made it easier for us to cross over wetlands and swamps a lot faster than trying to go all the way around. But it was also hard work because it kept snowing all the time. So the invention of the snowshoe is made for us to walk on top. And actually, while you're making and breaking that snowshoe trail, you're actually forcing the frost deep into the ground to help support your weight. But during pre-freeze and early parts of thaw, you still need your snowshoes to be able to stay above that snow. On the top right-hand corner is another view just of a hillside which leads down into this lake. Now, how it was explained to me is that because of this time period of the freeze up and the thaw, imagine what Champlain would have witnessed when he was the very first European to make it this far inland in this new world. He would have witnessed, I guess, for better explanation and comparison, if anybody had ever been to Stanley Park in BC before the damage from the hurricane, it could have looked very similar to that, or even like the Redwood Forest down in Northern California. It would have looked like that all over. And that's because that took thousands of years of cultivating, thousands of years of nurturing and looking after it, and being in tune with the rhythm and cycles of nature. And we used a very important tool to help us with that, and that was fire. Fire is its natural element, and it levels the playing field and it resets the balance. When things go out of balance, that's when she brings in her vacuum cleaner, and that's the fire. As devastating as a fire can be, some plants need that heat of that fire to release their seeds in order to regenerate. And so fire and that wood ash, those are the ones that shaped the earth and shaped all the forests that we knew until after contact. And then more importantly, in the Muskoka area, when they came and they deforested everything. You look at all of our old photos of every town that was being developed, there's not too many trees that are left standing. It's all barren rock. So when we talk about the watershed now, that we know and understand now, that's a man-made watershed. That's not natural, because they dammed all those rivers. They dammed all of them. And the purpose for damming them was because it was easier to float the logs towards the sawmill in the springtime, where it didn't need as many horses and teams of people. And then after all the resources were depleted, they left the dams behind, but they followed wherever the next logging site was going to be. And then when hydroelectric power became a thing, that's when they repurposed most of these dams in this area to generate hydroelectric power. Now, in case in point, when I talk about Wata specific, we felt the effects of that when they built the Big Eddy Power Dam and when they built the Ragged Rapid Power Dam and flooded out lots of acreage, including some of our own grave sites from when when our families first arrived here in 1881. Now, when I talk about man-made, I do mean that directly. It was affected by man who came in instead of looking at the whole ecosystem and how everything was growing together. They concentrated on maybe 3 types of trees that they felt was worthy of being picked. But they were surrounded by all these other trees which didn't see as much value, that they considered them to be garbage. And that Highway 11 between Washego and Gravenhurst was all corduroy road. They put all the logs of those trees that didn't have any value, laid them all down flat, and then they piled dirt on top of them. And that just goes to show that everything that we know and love about Muskoka is actually man-made, but it's not the healthiest either. Because the trees that we have growing that are the tallest, those are the trees that were damaged, maybe got diseased, were struggling to survive in a barren landscape when they were so used to having cover and lots of food. So anything that is caught between the dams, once they are gone, that's it. They will never regenerate again because they've blocked off the natural flow of the food and the nutrients that is needed for all these ecosystems. See, our understanding of the lake was that it was a deposit of large amounts of water, fresh water, that we can use, that we can drink, because it's constantly flowing. The fish were healthier and stronger because they were able to travel from Georgian Bay back all the way up to the Ottawa rivers and all in through all of the different channels and back again. There was that natural flow. But as soon as they started to block it off, it's like a clogged artery in your heart. After a while, it's not going to work anymore. Now, as much as winter time was a long period back then, and it has warmed up, there was certain activities that we would do in the wintertime to help not only pass the time away, but would strengthen our hunting skills, specifically our spear throwing. On the bottom right-hand corner, this picture is a demonstration that I did of the snow snake game, which is a Haudenosaunee game. It is played in the snow. We build a launching pad roughly about 3 feet across by at least 3.5 feet high, or at least hip height. And it's slanted, shaped like a pyramid. And then we take a log that's about 6 to 8 inches in diameter and up to 30 feet in length, as long as it's fairly straight. Take all the branches off, but leave the bark on. We would tie a rope to the tip of that tree, and then that rope would be attached to a stick. And on either side of this launch pad, there would be one person on either side, and they would drag that log and create this type of trough. And they would drag that all across from the launch pad, and about 30 to 40 feet, it would actually come down to ground level. And they would drag that log as straight line as they could for up to 2 miles. The snakes that we talk about are these sticks here. So the mud cats are only 3 feet in length, and they are a little wider. The longer snakes, they can be as long as 9 feet, between 6 and 9 feet in length. They start out as thin as, say, your baby finger. There's a notch cut into the end of that each snake, and that's where you would put it into the first knuckle of your index finger, and then you would hold it with your 3 fingers. And you would come at it on a full force run and try to launch it either sidearm or overhand and try to get it not only in the trough, but to keep it in the trough. And the object of the game is see which one will go the furthest. At the end of the snakes, we would, when lead was introduced, we would carve that and then we would melt the lead on top of that to protect the nose of that snake from any ice that might fall into that trough. So this demonstration was only about 40 feet in length. This was at the Canadian Raceboat Hall of Fame last year at Family Day. I did a demonstration. And how the game is actually won is by the person who is known as the shiner. This person knows how to read the snow, the temperature, the behavior of the snow, the types of crystals it'll be, because they would play from sun up until sundown until there was a winner. And Wata hosted a snow snake tournament back in 1997, March of 97, where we played on the lake that's in behind our administration building on Saturday. On the Sunday morning, there was over a foot of water on the lake, and we had to move the track, and we moved it to our cranberry marsh. And we built the track on the road going back towards Big Eddy. And we had people from as far away as New York, Cattaraugus, and they traveled all that distance to come up here and play snow snake. Here's another shot of where I'm just kind of gently placing it in there just to show it. And here is just a short little video to show you that it actually travels pretty fast. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to attention is that when we're looking at the watershed, we want to make sure that we're looking at it as an entire ecosystem. Because the dams were built for hydroelectric power and to hold back as much water as they can and then fluctuate the levels. There was no foresight in building any fish ladders in any of these dams. So any of the native species fish are struggling, especially the pickerel or the walleye. And I know back in the 70s, they used to have a fish hatchery, but I don't believe they were hatching any native species fish. They were only hatching just the sports fish. So those type of stressors have been introduced. And now that they don't use the dams for logging anymore, and now some people seem to think that it's being used to regulate the levels of the lakes and keep it from flooding. Well, that's something that nature has control over. And if we're going to make this a healthier ecosystem, we have to look at the entire system as a whole, just like a dream catcher. That dream catcher reminds us that everything is connected and it's all tied together. And even if one strand gets snipped, it won't fully fall apart. it takes time for it to unravel. But with enough pieces that get snipped, well, now it's starting to get really loose and it's not going to hold everything together. That something's going to have to give. But the beauty of it is that because those two ends are still there, we have an opportunity to reconnect and tie them together. Will it be different? Absolutely. Will it be strong enough? Time will tell. But if we can look at all of the earth in that same window of a human being, she is struggling. She has some sickness. However, she has also been here longer than human beings have been on this earth and has been doing this and going through these cycles and repeating. And how do we know this? Look at all of the records of volcanic eruptions and all the different changes and um, the ice age and the melt. Only this time with climate change, we're actually here to witness the melt at a high rate. It's not the first time it's happened because our stories tell us that at one time this was a water planet before Sky Woman fell through that hole in the sky. So hopefully by working together with Indigenous communities and listening to our stories, our legends, and how we know and understand our relationship with nature, that we can work together by pairing science with our understanding. And with the water quality and the algal blooms, to me, that tells me that something's missing in the whole ecosystem. And one of those things that is missing is definitely wild rice. From the stories that I heard from the Anishinaabe people, wherever they traveled, they always planted wild rice wherever they went. That way, on their way back, they would at least have a food source. But not only did wild rice support human life, it also supported other wildlife, which then introduced other animals to come in who would also eat not only the wild rice, but then they would start eating the algae and all these others. And they all worked together. And for me, that's pretty important to get that perspective and to remember we need the earth. The earth doesn't need the humans to exist, but the humans need the earth in order for us to exist. I want to thank you for allowing me to be a part of your session here. It's been a great honor to be amongst all these scholars and very well recognized scientists who have done some amazing work. My question to everybody is, when is there enough data to actually create action? And that's something that I think each and every one of us should really think about. So Nyawagoa Chimiglitch. And I'll hand it back over to
It'll be me, Christopher, Wendy.
Wendy. Sorry, I kind
Please,
of
that's okay. Please stay on the screen. So while we do the questions, that we have a few questions up here. Please make sure if you have any questions to put them in the question section, as well as vote for any of the, or hit like on any of the ones that you really want to have us answer tonight. So I'm just going to go through, I'll sort of alternate between our two speakers this evening. I'll start off with the top one. Andrew, this one is sort of for you. You didn't mention agricultural runoff as a lake stressor. Some lakes, particularly shallow lakes, suffer from high levels of nutrient runoff from agricultural runoff at stream inlets, phosphorus, nitrogen, E. coli. What do you recommend for these lakes, and how can farms and cottage associations work together to reduce the nutrient runoff?
That's a good question, and really gets two questions. On the first one, yeah, so agriculture broadly, I guess it would have caught it under land use, but you're right, I didn't focus on it for this talk, and It can be a stressor even here in the Shield. There are agricultural areas and farming and pasture land that can increase nutrients above what it would be if it were, say, a forested landscape. That's certainly true. There are a number of ways of trying to reduce that impact. Often we talk about best management practices. It depends on what kind of agriculture we're talking about. But if it's, say, cropland, sometimes we think about reducing inputs at the source. So I know some farmers are actively involved in testing soils for phosphorus so that they can target fertilizer applications when needed or try and reduce those inputs. And on the transport side too, so a big one, a lot of phosphorus is bound up with the soil, with the sediment. And if there are ways you can reduce erosion, ways you can reduce the flow of water, that's really important, for sure. And if it's more pastoral land you're talking about, then I know some farmers have been trying to fence off wildlife from or fence off, for example, cattle from getting into streams and defecating in streams and those kinds of things, and that finding other ways of giving them water other than the streams, so that get direct input. And either cropland or pasture land, if you can keep vegetated buffers along streams, along lakefronts, that helps with reducing that kind of erosional input. And on the second question, it's a really good one on how do you bring farmers and cottage associations together. I guess over my 24 years, I've been in rooms where there have been very good conversations and rooms where there has been a lot of blame laid. And I think the most successful examples that in the rooms that I've walked in is where we tried to start from a position of just initially just sharing open information where we could, trying to understand together where there are gaps in that information, and then trying to figure out how we can actually fill in the gaps with information. Like, because once you have actual information or shared data that you all agree was collected in a fair way and provides information about the ecosystem, then we're in a position where you can kind of discuss and test the various hypotheses. What is the importance of this one part of the ecosystem stress versus this one? And I found when you're working with the gathering together, collectively gathering data and sharing and looking at the data and coming to agreement all the way along the process, then you can get to a place where you can lead to more effective management.
Thank you. Is there any type of mentor programs to assist non-Indigenous people in learning the way of the land? Christopher, if you're answering, your volume's off. There you go. Thank you.
Well, there are a lot of organizations out there now that, like say for Trent University, they have an Indigenous Environmental Sciences program, and I believe that's Dr. Dan Longboat is the professor in that study, and he brings in both sides of not only Western science but Indigenous knowledge. There's also other areas such as the Woodland Cultural Center. To my knowledge, there's probably many more, but I know the Eagle Project itself is still an ongoing project. That's the effects of Aboriginals living in the Great Lakes environment. And it's just a matter of, like, we have all this technology at our fingertips and all the information is at our fingertips. It's just a matter of reaching out to some of the communities and find out any programming that they might offer. Same thing with friendship centers as well. I know everybody's starting to look at, uh, our way of life, especially with hunting and trapping and gathering medicines and stuff. The environment is top of mind, so everybody's really thinking hard about how can How can we do better? And it's learning about how to be better neighbors.
Thank you. What are the main water quality concerns for lakes on Watauga territory?
That's well, from my own observations, and since 1993, it'd be the same as everybody else, but I think more importantly, I think it's the runoffs that we're worried about, especially fuels coming in off the roads. I mean, back in 1993, there wasn't any gas stations, there wasn't any cigarette shops or what, like there was only the church and the old band office and our tennis courts and our ball diamond out there. And there wasn't a cloverleaf to Highway 69, nor was there an extension of the 400. So all of those environmental impacts, we're starting to see that in our water now at greater rates. I know we're noticing that the water temperature is staying warmer longer. Fish aren't as active or as plentiful as they once were. So those are all part of it, and there's probably more.
Thank you. What is the effect on lake temperatures with the increase of geothermal heating using the lake as a heat exchanger?
Oh, that's an interesting one. It's not one that I've seen a lot of literature on, actually. So that's, I guess they're different systems, right? I think there are closed loop systems and open loop systems. I can tell you, I mean, that's one I guess that we should start to watch. But I can tell you that when we try and understand what what is controlling lake temperature in lakes generally, we find that by far the strongest predictor of that is the air temperature, and so it all can also be impacted by things like how tea stained a lake is, and then often it's tea stained from natural organic carbon it's coming into lakes, and that absorbs a lot of heat as well. So unless I'm guess, I mean I don't know. So, but if it's unless it was we're talking a major increase in heat exchangers. Um, at the moment, I think it's things like the air temperature and the essentially the color of the water that's dramatically, controlling the heat in the lake. But that's one that I will put on my radar screen and see if I can find out any more information on that. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Question so the statement first is I have not heard of the metaphor of a dream catcher as a watershed. Is this common understanding of Indigenous peoples?
Well, my understanding is that when we communicated anything, we used a lot of symbolism as our reminders to jog our memory. And I like using that dream catcher as a metaphor myself because it's something concrete. Everybody recognizes that symbol. But I use it in my teachings to demonstrate that if you were to cut the string, what happens to it? And then the kids will say, "Oh, it's all going to fall apart." And then I show them. So I do a demonstration with it, and then so I cut this string, and it didn't. Well, how many strings will it take before it falls apart? So that's how I get them to start using their own critical thinking skills. And that's what our wampum belts are all about too. They're symbolisms. There's symbols there to remind us about what was discussed and what our agreements are all about. And it's one of the very first communications that we had as human beings to have an understanding, as we would use a symbol to show. And I don't know if anybody else would agree with what I'm doing. That's okay, but these are my thoughts, and this is what has worked for me to help get the importance across. That if we cut enough strings, pretty soon you can't repair it. Now you have to rebuild brand new.
Thank you. How well known is Dorset as an environmental research hub?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the academic and the researcher world, in the environmental field around water, it's very well known. It established itself 50 years ago and was really at the forefront of work on initially on understanding impacts of cottage development on nutrient inputs to lakes and really a world leader in understanding impacts of acid deposition on lakes. And I think the evidence of that, of how well known it's in those circles, comes from things like the international collaborations it continues to have. I think the monitoring record that it has that's so unique also attracts a lot of those collaborations. Our data are contributed to papers, yes, and also to some kind of global syntheses of data, and helping to inform changes in environmental stress really at a global level as well. So I think, the question is, how well is it known beyond those kind of academic circles? And I think locally it's known very, very well. I think maybe even parts of the province is known well, but I think I think there's always work to be done in continuing to share the stories that we tell.
There's sort of two questions that are dealing with calcium. I don't know if you can see them. One, so I think maybe you could combine the two answers. I'm not 100% sure if that can be done. How do we increase calcium levels for ecology without adding salt? But then the other one, why is calcium content in lakes continuing to deplete even though the acid rain has been reduced? So did you catch?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I did. I did. So
yeah.
the first one I think maybe is referring to the idea that one of the compounds that can be added is calcium chloride, and actually calcium chloride is sometimes used as a dust suppressant as well. And so um, you get the chloride out at the same time as the calcium. It's not the most commonly used. Like that's not really the solution to replenishing calcium, although it may have that effect in a sort of small scale watershed. I think the type of work that's being done with ash Muskoka in adding wood ash is like a major advancement forward in trying to replenish calcium levels in forest. It may have a trickle-down effect to water bodies as well. So I think that how I'd answer that question. Yeah, the calcium decline story is interesting. Why is it continue to decline? And partly it's a bit counterintuitive, but partly it's continuing to decline because of declines in sulfur deposition. Because they kind of track each other to a certain extent as well. If you're adding less acid through deposition to watersheds, then it pulls less calcium as well, and you get a gradual reduction as a result of that. The overall effect, though, is that calcium concentrations will go down below levels that they were prior to the onset of acid rain because you've lost this exchangeable bank of calcium in watershed soils. And also, there are other stressors, yes, that are removing calcium, contributing to this decline, as I mentioned very briefly. And one big one in some watersheds is as you remove trees have a lot of calcium. And if you take a tree and you take that tree out of the watershed, then you take the calcium with it. And often the new tree will grow in its place. As it does, it's going to suck up even more. It needs more calcium to grow. And so you have a net loss of calcium there. So yeah, there's more than one factor at play in what's causing the decline in calcium. And I guess it hasn't yet reached what we might call a new steady state, where eventually the inputs of calcium will equal what we're taking out through things like acid deposition and removal of timber harvesting, continuing to decline.
Thank you very much. Christopher, what has the role of the beaver been in the health of our ecosystem, and how has the assault on them affected the whole system?
Well, from our stories, the beaver was already here on this water planet as one of the animals. And its job is to hold back the water to make sure that we always have enough water. And beavers can hear running water from as far away as 5 miles away, and they will go and they'll travel to find where that water is running, and then they'll dam it up, and then they'll build channels so that they can keep an eye on those dams. And the beaver channel was strategic for them against predators. They made sure that they dug them down deep enough that they could dive underwater, and they can swim pretty far and pretty fast underwater, faster than, say, a predator can chase them on land. When you take the beaver out of that scenario, who's actually repairing those dams? Well, then they start to deteriorate, and then all that water gets lost and run off. When a beaver naturally exhausts its area, it'll find a new place to build a new pond, and then it'll let that area go back to naturalization. During the fur trade, they pretty much almost wiped out all of the beaver, which disrupted the entire natural system that the beavers developed. And as soon as you put a new beaver into that area, you'll notice that everything starts to grow a lot better, because now the water's being held back. It's not being run off as fast. So now the plants have an actual chance of drawing from that water and growing taller. And they're very important. It's just that everybody still looks at them as a nuisance and they want to get rid of them.
Thank you. Two questions on bubblers. One is my concern. My concern is the bubblers that have been added to in the last decade or so, and wondering what impact that may have on ice covers of our lakes. And the other one that is basically the same. Has there been any research on the impacts of bubblers on water quality?
Yeah, on the first one, I mean, bubblers themselves are going to interfere with the formation of that ice. I mean, think anywhere close to those bubblers, you have to be certainly cautious about how that ice is formed and maybe full of air. And I'd be very cautious about whether or not the effect of the lake as a whole. I haven't really come across seen anything directly, to be totally honest on that, if it affects the quality of the ice as a whole. But I can imagine local ice quality would be deteriorated, and let's be very cautious around that. Water quality, I'm not sure. That's I mean, it depends on the scale that this is happening, I guess, in the area, but maybe locally you've got an area where you might have that water exposed to the air for a long part of that winter season, and and more light may be able to penetrate. Maybe you get local effects on the algae, but nothing I've really directly come across and in some of the work that I've done.
Thank you. At this time, we're getting close to the end. Andrew and Christopher, do you have a couple of last minute points that you want to put out for us today, or wrap up on the subject?
Maybe I'm
Go ahead.
muted, so maybe I'll start, Chris. But I mean, I really enjoyed being here this evening and presenting, and I always love to share the things that I'm working on. I also want to say I really enjoyed sharing this time with Chris, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I am 53 too, and I'm wondering, I feel like we should sit and we should chat, and we could chat for a long time. I mean, you just reminded me of the importance of listening and observing and watching and knowing your history, and we come at it from different perspectives, but I'd love to talk more. And sorry, that was more for you than for the group, but those are my closing words. Thank you.
Thank you. Christopher?
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I'd be very interested in having those conversations. And the reason why my viewpoint is so different is because of my cancer journey. So I'm now 7 years cancer free. I had non-Hodgkin lymphoma. It was stage 4 aggressive immediately. My whole abdomen was a tumor, and I've been told I'm a walking miracle. And it was our the teachings, the Thanksgiving address. It was all the stories of my grandfather and all my great uncles that I listened to that helped me get through that journey, and it helped me to realize that life is really short. And sometimes what we put our energy into um, has been, I mean, it's great work and keeps us busy, but sometimes it's misdirected and uses up more time than what we have on this planet. And because we don't know when our time period is going to be up, when you get told you only got 5 years left to live, it sure puts everything into perspective real fast. And I just want to say that I bring the spirituality of our connection to nature. That's my new purpose. That's why he kept bringing me back here, because I have unfinished business yet. And I do believe that is to just remind us about slowing things down. Take the time to stop and notice that the earth is alive, and it looks after itself without human intervention. And it's about what can we learn from nature itself. She's our greatest teacher. She's our mother, and it's about remembering that and being grateful every day. Like every day you wake up is a gift. And it gives us a chance to start over. It gives us a chance to do better than we were yesterday. And to me, that's where I get my viewpoint on my worldview and how I try to share and just get as many people to think about it in those terms. Maybe we can do better. Let's hope so.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm going to pass the mic over to Norman Yan, just so to wrap up this today as well as this week the 3 series that we've had on our webinar. Norman?
Thank you, Wendy. And Andrew, let me encourage you to have a chat with Christopher. He likes the Cedar Canoe Bookstore for chats. So let me first thank our speakers. First, Sapna and Neil that introduced us to lakes in winter and lake physics. Then to Gord, who along with me talked about ecosystems near shore and offshore. And tonight, Andrew and Christopher, who talked about how we interact with lakes from a Western science perspective and from an indigenous perspective. There are many knowledge systems that can all help us understand our place in the world. I thank the several hundred of you that signed into these webinars. I hope you've increased your knowledge about how lakes work and how we should respect and interact with them in order to cease doing them harm, both for their sakes and our benefit. These 3 webinars were a joint effort of Friends of the Muskoka Watershed and the Muskoka Discovery Center. This is our 3rd webinar collaboration, as John Miller said earlier, and it's been a delight for me to work with the Discovery Center and Friends of the Muskoka Watershed staff and volunteers in their preparation. But let me in particular thank the board chairs, Gary and Lenore, for their support and leadership, Wendy, John, Lenore, and Sandy for their roles during the webinars, Jordan for his technical support, and Bob Mars for his overall leadership on behalf of the Discovery Center and his fine marketing and content videos. The recordings of these webinars are available for the first 2 webinars now, and the ones this evening will be available within the next week. So I hope we're not done. what should we do next in future webinars? I'd like to organize one or a couple on community engagement and reasons for hope. But if you have any ideas for future webinars, do let us know. You can email me, norman@fotmw.org. And with that, I'll say thank you, merci, and miigwech, and I hope to see you all again. Take care.